Book 5. The Effects of the Elixir. Chapter 1. It will be remembered that we left Master Paolo by the bedside of Glyndon, and as, waking from that profound slumber, the recollections of the past night came horribly back to his mind, the Englishman uttered a cry and covered his face with his hands. "Good morrow, Excellency," said Paolo gaily. "Corpo di Bacco, you have slept soundly." The sound of this man's voice, so lusty, ringing, and healthful, served to scatter before it the phantasma that yet haunted Glyndon's memory. He rose erect in his bed. "And where did you find me? Why are you here?" "Where did I find you?" repeated Paolo in surprise. "In your bed, to be sure. Why am I here? Because the padrone bade me await your awaking and attend your commands." "The padrone? Mejnour? Is he arrived?" "Arrived and departed, signor. He has left this letter for you." "Give it to me, and wait without till I am dressed." "At your service. I have bespoke an excellent breakfast. You must be hungry. I am a very tolerable cook. A monk's son ought to be. You'll be startled at my genius in the dressing of fish. My singing, I trust, will not disturb you. I always sing while I prepare a salad. It harmonizes the ingredients." And, slinging his carbine over his shoulder, Paolo sauntered from the room and closed the door. Glyndon was already deep in the contents of the following letter. "When I first received thee as my pupil, I promised Zanoni, if convinced by thy first trials that thou couldst but swell, not the number of our order, but the list of the victims who have aspired to it in vain, I would not rear thee to thine own wretchedness and doom. I would dismiss thee back to the world. I fulfill my promise. Thine ordeal has been the easiest that neophyte ever knew. I asked for nothing but abstinence from the sensual and a brief experiment of thy patience and thy faith. Go back to thine own world. Thou hast no nature to aspire to ours. It was I who prepared Paolo to receive thee at the revel. It was I who instigated the old beggar to ask thee for alms. It was I who left open the book that thou couldst not read without violating my command. Well, thou hast seen what awaits thee at the threshold of knowledge. Thou hast confronted the first foe that menaces him whom the senses yet grasp and enthrall. Dost thou wonder that I close upon thee the gates forever? Dost thou not comprehend, at last, that it needs a soul tempered and purified and raised, not by external spells, but by its own sublimity and valor, to pass the threshold and disdain the foe? Wretch, all my science avails nothing for the rash, for the sensual, for him who desires our secrets but to pollute them to gross enjoyments and selfish vice. How have the impostors and sorcerers of the earlier times perished by their very attempt to penetrate the mysteries that should purify and not deprave? They have boasted of the philosopher's stone and died in rags, of the immortal elixir and sunk to their grave, gray before their time. Legends tell you that the fiend rent them into fragments. Yes, the fiend of their own unholy desires and criminal designs. What they coveted, thou covetest, and if thou hadst the wings of a seraph, thou couldst soar not from the slough of thy mortality. Thy desire for knowledge, but petulant presumption, thy thirst for happiness, but the diseased longing for the unclean and muddied waters of corporeal pleasure, thy very love, which usually elevates even the mean, a passion that calculates treason amidst the first glow of lust. Thou, one of us, thou a brother of the august order, thou an aspirant to the stars that shine in the Shemaiah of the Chaldean lore. The eagle can raise but the eaglet to the sun. I abandon thee to thy twilight. But, alas for thee, disobedient and profane, thou hast inhaled the elixir. Thou hast attracted to thy presence the ghastly and remorseless foe. Thou thyself must exorcise the phantom thou hast raised. Thou must return to the world, but not without punishment and strong effort canst thou regain the calm and the joy of the life thou hast left behind. This, for thy comfort, will I tell thee. He who has drawn into his frame even so little of the volatile and vital energy of the aerial juices as thyself, has awakened faculties that cannot sleep, faculties that may yet, with patient humility, with sound faith, and the courage that is not of the body like thine, but of the resolute and virtuous mind, attain, if not to the knowledge that reigns above, to high achievement in the career of men. Thou wilt find the restless influence in all that thou wouldst undertake. Thy heart, amidst vulgar joys, will aspire to something holier. Thy ambition, amidst coarse excitement, to something beyond thy reach. But deem not that this of itself will suffice for glory. Equally may the craving lead thee to shame and guilt. It is but an imperfect and new-born energy which will not suffer thee to repose. As thou directest it, must thou believe it to be the emanation of thine evil genius or thy good. But woe to thee, insect meshed in the web in which thou hast entangled limbs and wings. Thou hast not only inhaled the elixir, thou hast conjured the spectre. Of all the tribes of the space, no foe is so malignant to man. And thou hast lifted the veil from thy gaze. I cannot restore to thee the happy dimness of thy vision. Know, at least, that all of us, the highest and the wisest, who have, in sober truth, passed beyond the threshold, have had as our first fearful task to master and subdue its grisly and appalling guardian. Know that thou canst deliver thyself from those livid eyes. Know that while they haunt, they cannot harm, if thou resistest the thoughts to which they tempt, and the horror they engender. Dread them most when thou beholdest them not. And thus, son of the worm, we part. All that I can tell thee to encourage, yet to warn and to guide, I have told thee in these lines. Not from me, from thyself, hast come the gloomy trial, from which I yet trust thou wilt emerge into peace. Type of the knowledge that I serve, I withhold no lesson from the pure aspirant. I am a dark enigma to the general seeker. As man's only indestructible possession is his memory, so it is not in mine art to crumble into matter the immaterial thoughts that have sprung up within thy breast. The tyro might shatter this castle to the dust, and topple down the mountain to the plain. The master has no power to say, exist no more, to one thought that his knowledge has inspired. Thou mayst change the thoughts into new forms. Thou mayst rarefy and sublimate it into a finer spirit, but thou canst not annihilate that which has no home but in the memory, no substance but the idea. Every thought is as a soul. Vainly, therefore, would I or thou undo the past, or restore to thee the gay blindness of thy youth. Thou must endure the influence of the elixir thou hast inhaled. Thou must wrestle with the spectre thou hast invoked. The letter fell from Glyndon's hand. A sort of stupor succeeded to the various emotions which had chased each other in the perusal, a stupor resembling that which follows the sudden destruction of any ardent and long-nursed hope in the human heart, whether it be of love, of avarice, of ambition. The loftier world for which he had so thirsted, sacrificed, and toiled was closed upon him for ever, and by his own faults of rashness and presumption. But Glyndon's was not of that nature which submits long to condemn itself. His indignation began to kindle against Mejnour, who owned he had tempted, and who now abandoned him to the presence of a spectre. The mystic's reproaches stung rather than humbled him. What crime had he committed to deserve language so harsh and disdainful? Was it so deep a debasement to feel pleasure in the smile and the eyes of Felidae? Had not Zanoni himself confessed love for Viola? Had he not fled with her as his companion? Glyndon never paused to consider if there are no distinctions between one kind of love and another. Where, too, was the great offence of yielding to a temptation which only existed for the brave? Had not the mystic volume, which Mejnour had purposely left open, bid him but beware of fear? Was not, then, every wilful provocation held out to the strongest influences of the human mind, in the prohibition to enter the chamber, in the possession of the key which excited his curiosity, in the volume which seemed to dictate the mode by which the curiosity was to be gratified? As rapidly these thoughts passed over him, he began to consider the whole conduct of Mejnour either as a perfidious design to entrap him to his own misery, or as the trick of an impostor who knew that he could not realize the great professions he had made. On glancing again over the more mysterious threats and warnings in Mejnour's letter, they seemed to assume the language of mere parable and allegory, the jargon of the Platonist and Pythagoreans. By little and little he began to consider that the very spectra he had seen, even that one phantom so horrid in its aspect, were but the delusions which Mejnour's science had enabled him to raise. The healthful sunlight, filling up every cranny in his chamber, seemed to laugh away the terrors of the past night. His pride and his resentment nerved his habitual courage, and when, having hastily dressed himself, he rejoined Paolo, it was with a flushed cheek and a haughty step. "So, Paolo," said he, "the padrone, as you call him, told you to expect and welcome me at your village feast." "He did so by a message from a wretched old cripple. This surprised me at the time, for I thought he was far distant. But these great philosophers make a joke of 200 or 300 leagues." "But why did you not tell me you had heard from Mejnour?" "Because the old cripple forbade me." "Did you not see the man afterwards, during the dance?" "No, Excellency." "Humph. Allow me to serve you," said Paolo, piling Glyndon's plate and then filling his glass. "I wish, signor, now the padrone is gone, not," added Paolo, as he cast rather a frightened and suspicious glance round the room, "that I mean to say anything disrespectful of him. I wish, I say, now that he is gone, that you would take pity on yourself, and ask your own heart what your youth was meant for, not to bury yourself alive in these old ruins, and endanger your body and soul by studies which I am sure no saint could approve of." "Are the saints so partial, then, to your own occupations, Master Paolo?" "Why," answered the bandit, a little confused, "a gentleman with plenty of pistoles in his purse need not, of necessity, make it his profession to take away the pistoles of other people. It is a different thing for us poor rogues. After all, too, I always devote a tithe of my gains to the Virgin, and I share the rest charitably with the poor. But eat, drink, enjoy yourself. Be absolved by your confessor for any little peccadilloes that don't run 2 long scores at a time. That's my advice. Your health, Excellency. Pshaw, signor. Fasting, except on the days prescribed to a good Catholic, only engenders phantoms." "Phantoms?" "Yes, the devil always tempts the empty stomach, to covet, to hate, to thieve, to rob, and to murder. These are the natural desires of a man who is famishing. With a full belly, signor, we are at peace with all the world. That's right, you like the partridge. Cospetto, when I myself have passed 2 or 3 days in the mountains, with nothing from sunset to sunrise but a black crust and an onion, I grow as fierce as a wolf. That's not the worst, too. In these times I see little imps dancing before me. Oh yes, fasting is as full of spectres as a field of battle." Glyndon thought there was some sound philosophy in the reasoning of his companion, and certainly the more he ate and drank, the more the recollection of the past night and of Mejnour's desertion faded from his mind. The casement was open, the breeze blew, the sun shone, all nature was merry, and merry as nature herself grew Maestro Paolo. He talked of adventures, of travel, of women, with a hearty gusto that had its infection. But Glyndon listened yet more complacently when Paolo turned with an arch smile to praises of the eye, the teeth, the ankles, and the shape of the handsome Valide. This man, indeed, seemed the very personation of animal sensual life. he would have been to Faust a more dangerous tempter than Mephistopheles. There was no sneer on his lip at the pleasures which animated his voice. To one awaking to a sense of the vanities in knowledge, this reckless, ignorant joyousness of temper was a worse corrupter than all the icy mockeries of a learned fiend. But when Paolo took his leave, with the promise to return the next day, the mind of the Englishman again settled back to a graver and more thoughtful mood. The elixir seemed, in truth, to have left the refining effects Mejnour had ascribed to it. As Glyndon paced to and fro the solitary corridor, or, pausing, gazed upon the extended and glorious scenery that stretched below, high thoughts of enterprise and ambition, bright visions of glory, passed in rapid succession through his soul. "Mejnour denies me his science. Well," said the painter proudly, "he has not robbed me of my art." "What, Clarence Glyndon, dost thou return to that from which thy career commenced? Was Zanoni right after all?" He found himself in the chamber of the mystic, not a vessel, not an herb. The solemn volume is vanished. The elixir shall sparkle for him no more. But still in the room itself seems to linger the atmosphere of a charm. Faster and fiercer it burns within thee, the desire to achieve, to create. Thou longest for a life beyond the sensual, but the life that is permitted to all genius, that which breathes through the immortal work and endures in the imperishable name. Where are the implements for thine art? Tush! When did the true workman ever fail to find his tools? Thou art again in thine own chamber, the white wall thy canvas, a fragment of charcoal for thy pencil. They suffice, at least, to give outline to the conception that may otherwise vanish with the morrow. The idea that thus excited the imagination of the artist was unquestionably noble and august. It was derived from that Egyptian ceremonial which Diodorus has recorded, the judgment of the dead by the living, when the corpse, duly embalmed, is placed by the margin of the Acherusian lake, and before it may be consigned to the bark which is to bear it across the waters to its final resting place, it is permitted to the appointed judges to hear all accusations of the past life of the deceased, and, if proved, to deprive the corpse of the rites of sepulture. Unconsciously to himself, it was Mejnour's description of this custom, which he had illustrated by several anecdotes not to be found in books, that now suggested the design to the artist, and gave it reality and force. He supposed a powerful and guilty king, whom in life scarce a whisper had dared to arraign, but against whom, now the breath was gone, came the slave from his fetters, the mutilated victim from his dungeon, livid and squalid as if dead themselves, invoking with parched lips the justice that outlives the grave. Strange fervor this, O artist, breaking suddenly forth from the mists and darkness which the occult science had spread so long over thy fancies. Strange that the reaction of the night's terror and the day's disappointment should be back to thine holy art. Oh, how freely goes the bold hand over the large outline! How, despite those rude materials, speaks forth no more the pupil, but the master. Fresh yet from the glorious elixir, how thou givest to thy creatures the finer life denied to thyself. Some power not thine own writes the grand symbols on the wall. Behind rises the mighty sepulchre, on the building of which repose to the dead the lives of thousands had been consumed. There sit in a semicircle the solemn judges. Black and sluggish flows the lake. There lies the mummified and royal dead. Dost thou quail at the frown on his lifelike brow? Ha! Bravely done, O artist! Up rise the haggard forms. Pale speak the ghastly faces. Shall not humanity, after death, avenge itself on power? Thy conception, Clarence Glyndon, is a sublime truth. Thy design promises renown to genius. Better this magic than the charms of the volume and the vessel. Hour after hour has gone. Thou hast lighted the lamp. Night sees thee yet at thy labor. Merciful heaven! What chills the atmosphere? Why does the lamp grow wan? Why does thy hair bristle? There, 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 at the casement! It gazes on thee, the dark-mantled, loathsome thing. There, with their devilish mockery and hateful craft, glare on thee those horrid eyes. He stood and gazed. It was no delusion. It spoke not, moved not, till, unable to bear longer that steady and burning look, he covered his face with his hands. With a start, with a thrill, he removed them. He felt the nearer presence of the nameless. There it cowered on the floor beside his design, and lo, the figures seemed to start from the wall. Those pale, accusing figures, the shapes he himself had raised, frowned at him and gibbered. With a violent effort that convulsed his whole being and bathed his body in the sweat of agony, the young man mastered his horror. He strode towards the phantom. He endured its eyes. He accosted it with a steady voice. He demanded its purpose and defied its power. And then, as a wind from a charnel, was heard its voice. What it said, what revealed, it is forbidden the lips to repeat, the hand to record. Nothing save the subtle life that yet animated the frame to which the inhalations of the elixir had given vigor and energy beyond the strength of the strongest, could have survived that awful hour. Better to wake in the catacombs and see the buried rise from their sermons and hear the ghouls in their horrid orgies amongst the festering ghastliness of corruption, than to front those features when the veil was lifted and to listen to that whispered voice. The next day, Glyndon fled from the ruined castle. With what hopes of starry light had he crossed the threshold? With what memories to shudder evermore at the darkness did he look back at the frown of its time-worn towers? Book 5, Chapter 2. Draw your chair to the fireside, brush clean the hearth, and trim the lights. O home of sleekness, order, substance, comfort! O excellent thing art thou, matter of fact! It is some time after the date of the last chapter. Here we are, not in moonlit islands or mouldering castles, but in a room 26 feet by 22, well carpeted, well cushioned, solid armchairs, and 8 such bad pictures in such fine frames upon the walls. Thomas Mervale, Esquire, Merchant of London, you are an enviable dog. It was the easiest thing in the world for Mervale, on returning from his continental episode of life, to settle down to his desk. His heart had been always there. The death of his father gave him, as a birthright, a high position in a respectable though second-rate firm. To make this establishment first-rate was an honorable ambition. It was his. He had lately married, not entirely for money. No, he was worldly rather than mercenary. He had no romantic ideas of love, but he was too sensible a man not to know that a wife should be a companion, not merely a speculation. He did not care for beauty and genius, but he liked health and good temper, and a certain proportion of useful understanding. He chose a wife from his reason, not his heart, and a very good choice he made. Mrs. Mervale was an excellent young woman, bustling, managing, economical, but affectionate and good. She had a will of her own, but was no shrew. She had a great notion of the rights of a wife, and a strong perception of the qualities that ensure comfort. She would never have forgiven her husband had she found him guilty of the most passing fancy for another, but in return she had the most admirable sense of propriety herself. She held in abhorrence all levity, all flirtation, all coquetry, small vices which often ruin domestic happiness, but which a giddy nature incurs without consideration. But she did not think it right to love a husband overmuch. She left a surplus of affection for all her relations, all her friends, some of her acquaintances, and the possibility of a second marriage, should any accident happen to Mr. M. She kept a good table, for it suited their station, and her temper was considered even, though firm. But she could say a sharp thing or two, if Mr. Mervale was not punctual to a moment. She was very particular that he should change his shoes on coming home. The carpets were new and expensive. She was not sulky, nor passionate, heaven bless her for that. But when displeased, she showed it, administered a dignified rebuke, alluded to her own virtues, to her uncle, who was an admiral, and to the 30,000 pounds which she had brought to the object of her choice. But as Mr. Mervale was a good-humoured man, owned his faults, and subscribed to her excellence, the displeasure was soon over. Every household has its little disagreements, none fewer than that of Mr. and Mrs. Mervale. Mrs. Mervale, without being improperly fond of dress, paid due attention to it. She was never seen out of her chamber with papers in her hair, nor in that worst of disillusions, a morning wrapper. At 8:30 every morning, Mrs. Mervale was dressed for the day, that is, till she redressed for dinner. Her stays well laced, her cap prim, her gowns, winter and summer, of a thick, handsome silk. Ladies at that time wore very short waists. So did Mrs. Mervale. Her morning ornaments were a thick gold chain to which was suspended a gold watch. None of those fragile dwarfs of mechanism that look so pretty and go so ill, but a handsome repeater which chronicled Father Time to a moment. Also a mosaic brooch, also a miniature of her uncle, the Admiral, set in a bracelet. For the evening she had 2 handsome sets, necklace, earrings, and bracelets complete, one of amethysts, the other topazes. With these, her costume, for the most part, was a gold-coloured satin and a turban, in which last her picture had been taken. Mrs. Mervale had an aquiline nose, good teeth, fair hair, and light eyelashes, rather a high complexion, what is generally called a fine bust, full cheeks, large useful feet made for walking, large white hands with filbert nails, on which not a speck of dust had, even in childhood, ever been known to alight. She looked a little older than she really was, but that might arise from a certain air of dignity in the aforesaid aquiline nose. She generally wore short mittens. She never read any poetry but Goldsmith's and Cowper's. She was not amused by novels, though she had no prejudice against them. She liked a play and a pantomime, with a slight supper afterwards. She did not like concerts nor operas. At the beginning of the winter she selected some book to read and some piece of work to commence. The 2 lasted her till the spring, when, though she continued to work, she left off reading. Her favourite study was history, which she read through the medium of Dr. Goldsmith. Her favourite author in the belles lettres was, of course, Dr. Johnson. A worthier woman, or one more respected, was not to be found, except in an epitaph. It was an autumn night. Mr. and Mrs. Mervale, lately returned from an excursion to Weymouth, are in the drawing-room. The dame sat on this side, the man sat on that. Yes, I assure you, my dear, that Glyndon, with all his eccentricities, was a very engaging, amiable fellow. You would certainly have liked him. All the women did. My dear Thomas, you will forgive the remark, but that expression of yours, all the women. I beg your pardon, you are right. I meant to say that he was a general favourite with your charming sex. I understand. Rather a frivolous character. Frivolous? No, not exactly. A little unsteady. Very odd, but certainly not frivolous. Presumptuous and headstrong in character, but modest and shy in his manners. Rather too much so. Just what you like. However, to return. I am seriously uneasy at the accounts I have heard of him to-day. He has been living, it seems, a very strange and irregular life, travelling from place to place, and must have spent already a great deal of money. Apropos of money, said Mrs. Mervale, I fear we must change our butcher. He is certainly in league with the cook. That is a pity. His beef is remarkably fine. These London servants are as bad as the Carbonari. But, as I was saying, poor Glyndon." Here a knock was heard at the door. "Bless me," said Mrs. Mervale, "it is past 10. Who can that possibly be?" "Perhaps your uncle the Admiral," said the husband, with a slight peevishness in his accent. "He generally favours us about this hour." "I hope, my love, that none of my relations are unwelcome visitors at your house. The Admiral is a most entertaining man, and his fortune is entirely at his own disposal." "No one I respect more," said Mr. Mervale, with emphasis. The servant threw open the door, and announced Mr. Glyndon. "Mr. Glyndon! What an extraordinary—" exclaimed Mrs. Mervale, but before she could conclude the sentence, Glyndon was in the room. The two friends greeted each other with all the warmth of early recollection and long absence. An appropriate and proud presentation to Mrs. Mervale ensued, and Mrs. Mervale, with a dignified smile and a furtive glance at his boots, bade her husband's friend welcome to England. Glyndon was greatly altered since Mervale had seen him last. Though less than 2 years had elapsed since then, his fair complexion was more bronzed and manly. Deep lines of care, or thought, or dissipation, had replaced the smooth contour of happy youth. To a manner once gentle and polished had succeeded a certain recklessness of mien, tone, and bearing, which bespoke the habits of a society that cared little for the calm decorums of conventional ease. Still, a kind of wild nobleness, not before apparent in him, characterized his aspect, and gave something of dignity to the freedom of his language and gestures. "So then, you are settled, Mervale. I need not ask you if you are happy. Worth, sense, wealth, character, and so fair a companion, deserves happiness, and command it." "Would you like some tea, Mr. Glyndon?" asked Mrs. Mervale kindly. "Thank you, no. I propose a more convivial stimulus to my old friend. Wine, Mervale. Wine, eh? Or a bowl of old English punch. Your wife will excuse us. We will make a night of it." Mrs. Mervale drew back her chair, and tried not to look aghast. Glyndon did not give his friend time to reply. "So at last I am in England," he said, looking round the room, with a slight sneer on his lips. "Surely this sober air must have its influence. Surely here I shall be like the rest." "Have you been ill, Glyndon?" "Ill? Yes. Humph. You have a fine house. Does it contain a spare room for a solitary wanderer?" Mr. Mervale glanced at his wife, and his wife looked steadily on the carpet. Modest and shy in his manners, rather too much so, Mrs. Mervale was in seventh heaven of indignation and amaze. "My dear," said Mr. Mervale, at last, meekly and interrogatingly. "My dear," returned Mrs. Mervale innocently and sourly. "We can make up a room for my old friend, Sarah." The old friend had sunk back on his chair, and, gazing intently on the fire, with his feet at ease upon the fender, seemed to have forgotten his question. Mrs. Mervale bit her lips, looked thoughtfully, and at last coldly replied, "Certainly, Mr. Mervale, your friends do right to make themselves at home." With that she lighted a candle and moved majestically from the room. When she returned, the two friends had vanished into Mr. Mervale's study. 12 o'clock struck, 1 o'clock, 2. Thrice had Mrs. Mervale sent into the room to know, first, if they wanted anything; secondly, if Mr. Glyndon slept on a mattress or feather-bed; thirdly, to inquire if Mr. Glyndon's trunk, which he had brought with him, should be unpacked. And to the answer to all these questions was added, in a loud voice from the visitor, a voice that pierced from the kitchen to the attic, "Another bowl, stronger if you please, and be quick with it." At last Mr. Mervale appeared in the conjugal chamber, not penitent nor apologetic. No, not a bit of it. His eyes twinkled, his cheek flushed, his feet reeled. He sang. Mr. Mervale positively sang. "Mr. Mervale, is it possible, sir? Old King Cole was a merry old soul. Mr. Mervale, sir! Leave me alone, sir! and a merry old soul was he. What an example to the servants! And he called for his pipe, and he called for his bowl. If you don't keep your hands to yourself, sir, I shall call. Call for his fiddlers 3. Book 5, Chapter 3. The next morning at breakfast, Mrs. Mervale looked as if all the wrongs of injured woman sat upon her brow. Mr. Mervale seemed the picture of remorseful guilt and avenging bile. He said little except to complain of headache and to request the eggs to be removed from the table. Clarence Glendon, impervious, unconscious, unailing, impenitent, was in noisy spirits and talked for 3. Poor Mervale, he has lost the habit of good fellowship, madame. Another night or 2, and he will be himself again. Sir, said Mrs. Mervale, launching a premeditated sentence with more than Johnsonian dignity, permit me to remind you that Mr. Mervale is now a married man, the destined father of a family, and the present master of a household. Precisely the reasons why I envy him so much. I myself have a great mind to marry. Happiness is contagious. Do you still take to painting? Said Mervale languidly, endeavoring to turn the tables on his guest. Oh no, I have adopted your advice. No art, no ideal. Nothing loftier than commonplace for me now. If I were to paint again, I positively think you would purchase my pictures. Make haste and finish your breakfast, man. I wish to consult you. I have come to England to see after my affairs. My ambition is to make money. Your counsels and experience cannot fail to assist me here. Ah, you are soon disenchanted of your philosopher's stone. You must know, Sarah, that when I last left Glendon, he was bent upon turning alchemist and magician. You're witty today, Mr. Mervale. Upon my honor, it is true. I told you so before. Glendon rose abruptly. Why revive those recollections of folly and presumption? Have I not said that I have returned to my native land to pursue the healthful avocations of my kind? Oh yes, what so healthful, so noble, so fitted to our nature as what you call the practical life? If we have faculties, what is their use but to sell them to advantage? Buy knowledge as we do our goods. Buy it at the cheapest market, sell it at the dearest. Have you not breakfasted yet? The friends walked into the streets, and Mervale shrank from the irony with which Glendon complimented him on his respectability, his station, his pursuits, his happy marriage, and his 8 pictures in their handsome frames. Formerly, the sober Mervale had commanded an influence over his friend. His had been the sarcasm. Glendon's the irresolute shame at his own peculiarities. Now this position was reversed. There was a fierce earnestness in Glendon's altered temper which awed and silenced the quiet commonplace of his friend's character. He seemed to take a malignant delight in persuading himself that the sober life of the world was contemptible and base. Ah, he exclaimed, how right you were to tell me to marry respectably, to have a solid position, to live in decorous fear of the world and one's wife, and to command the envy of the poor, the good opinion of the rich. You have practiced what you preach. Delicious existence, the merchant's desk and the curtain lecture. Ha ha! Shall we have another night of it? Mervale, embarrassed and irritated, turned the conversation upon Glendon's affairs. He was surprised at the knowledge of the world which the artist seemed to have suddenly acquired, surprised still more at the acuteness and energy with which he spoke of the speculations most in vogue at the market. Yes, Glendon was certainly in earnest. He desired to be rich and respectable, and to make at least 10% for his money. After spending some days with the merchant, during which time he contrived to disorganize all the mechanism of the house, to turn night into day, harmony into discord, to drive poor Mrs. Mervale half distracted, and to convince her husband that he was horribly henpecked, the ill-omened visitor left them as suddenly as he had arrived. He took a house of his own. He sought the society of persons of substance. He devoted himself to the money market. He seemed to have become a man of business. His schemes were bold and colossal, his calculations rapid and profound. He startled Mervale by his energy and dazzled him by his success. Mervale began to envy him, to be discontented with his own regular and slow gains. When Glyndon bought or sold in funds, wealth rolled upon him like the tide of a sea. What years of toil could not have done for him in art, a few months, by a succession of lucky chances, did for him in speculation. Suddenly, however, he relaxed his exertions. New objects of ambition seemed to attract him. If he heard a drum in the streets, what glory like the soldiers! If a new poem were published, what renown like the poets! He began works in literature, which promised great excellence, to throw them aside in disgust. All at once he abandoned the decorous and formal society he had courted. He joined himself with young and riotous associates. He plunged into the wildest excesses of the great city, where gold reigns alike over toil and pleasure. Through all, he carried with him a certain power and heat of soul. In all society he aspired to command, in all pursuits to excel. Yet, whatever the passion of the moment, the reaction was terrible in its gloom. He sank, at times, into the most profound and the darkest reveries. His fever was that of a mind that would escape memory, his repose that of a mind which the memory seizes again and devours as a prey. Mervale now saw little of him. They shunned each other. Glyndon had no confidant and no friend. Book 5, Chapter 4. From this state of restlessness and agitation, rather than continuous action, Glyndon was aroused by a visitor who seemed to exercise the most salutary influence over him. His sister, an orphan with himself, had resided in the country with her aunt. In the early years of hope and home he had loved this girl, much younger than himself, with all a brother's tenderness. On his return to England, he had seemed to forget her existence. She recalled herself to him on her aunt's death by a touching and melancholy letter. She had now no home but his, no dependence save on his affection. He wept when he read it, and was impatient till Adela arrived. This girl, then about 18, concealed beneath a gentle and calm exterior much of the romance or enthusiasm that had, at her own age, characterized her brother. But her enthusiasm was of a far purer order, and was restrained within proper bounds, partly by the sweetness of a very feminine nature, and partly by a strict and methodical education. She had differed from him, especially in a timidity of character, which exceeded that usual at her age, but which the habit of self-command concealed no less carefully than the timidity itself concealed the romance I have ascribed to her. Adela was not handsome. She had the complexion and the form of delicate health, and too fine an organization of the nerves rendered her susceptible to every impression that could influence the health of the frame through the sympathy of the mind. But as she never complained, and as the singular serenity of her manners seemed to betoken an equanimity of temperament which, with the vulgar, might have passed for indifference, her sufferings had so long been borne unnoticed that it ceased to be an effort to disguise them. Though, as I have said, not handsome, her countenance was interesting and pleasing, and there was that caressing kindness, that winning charm about her smile, her manners, her anxiety to please, to comfort, and to soothe, which went at once to the heart, and made her lovely, because so loving. Such was the sister whom Glyndon had so long neglected, and whom he now so cordially welcomed. Adela had passed many years a victim to the caprices, and a nurse to the maladies, of a selfish and exacting relation. The delicate and generous and respectful affection of her brother was no less new to her than delightful. He took pleasure in the happiness he created. He gradually weaned himself from other society. He felt the charm of home. It is not surprising, then, that this young creature, free and virgin from every more ardent attachment, concentrated all her grateful love on this cherished and protecting relative. Her study by day, her dream by night, was to repay him for his affection. She was proud of his talents, devoted to his welfare. The smallest trifle that could interest him swelled in her eyes to the gravest affairs of life. In short, all the long-hoarded enthusiasm, which was her perilous and only heritage, she invested in this one object of her holy tenderness, her pure ambition. But in proportion as Glyndon shunned those excitements by which he had so long sought to occupy his time or distract his thoughts, the gloom of his calmer hours became deeper and more continuous. He ever and especially dreaded to be alone. He could not bear his new companion to be absent from his eyes. He rode with her, walked with her, and it was with visible reluctance, which almost partook of horror, that he retired to rest at an hour when even revel grows fatigued. This gloom was not like that which could be called by the soft name of melancholy. It was far more intense. It seemed rather like despair. Often after a silence as of death, so heavy, abstracted, motionless did it appear, would he start abruptly and cast hurried glances around him, his limbs trembling, his lips livid, his brows bathed in dew, convinced that some secret sorrow preyed upon his mind and would consume his health. It was the dearest as the most natural desire of Adela to become his confidant and consoler. She observed, with the quick tact of the delicate, that he disliked her to seem affected by, or even sensible of, his darker moods. She schooled herself to suppress her fears and her feelings. She would not ask his confidence. She sought to steal into it. By little and little she felt that she was succeeding. Too wrapped in his own strange existence to be acutely observant of the character of others, Glyndon mistook the self-content of a generous and humble affection for constitutional fortitude, and this quality pleased and soothed him. It is fortitude that the diseased mind requires in the confidant whom it selects as its physician. And how irresistible is that desire to communicate! How often the lonely man thought to himself, "My heart would be lightened of its misery if once confessed." He felt, too, that in the very youth, the inexperience, the poetical temperament of Adela, he could find one who would comprehend and bear with him better than any sterner and more practical nature. Mervale would have looked on his revelations as the ravings of madness, and most men, at best, as the sicklied chimeras, the optical delusions of disease. Thus gradually preparing himself for that relief for which he yearned, the moment for his disclosure arrived thus. One evening, as they sat alone together, Adela, who inherited some portion of her brother's talent in art, was employed in drawing, and Glyndon, rousing himself from meditations less gloomy than usual, rose and, affectionately passing his arm around her waist, looked over her as she sat. An exclamation of dismay broke from his lips. He snatched the drawing from her hand. "What are you about? What portrait is this?" "Dear Clarence, do you not remember the original? It is a copy from that portrait of our wise ancestor, which our poor mother used to say so strongly resembled you. I thought it would please you if I copied it from memory." "Accursed was the likeness," said Glyndon gloomily. "Guess you not the reason why I have shunned to return to the home of my fathers? Because I dreaded to meet that portrait. Because... But pardon me, I alarm you." "Ah, no, Clarence, you never alarm me when you speak, only when you are silent. Oh, if you thought me worthy of your trust! Oh, if you had given me the right to reason with you in the sorrows that I yearn to share!" Glyndon made no answer, but paced the room for some moments with disordered strides. He stopped at last and gazed at her earnestly. "Yes, you too are his descendant. You know that such men have lived and suffered. You will not mock me. You will not disbelieve. Listen. Hark, what is that sound?" "But the wind on the housetop, Clarence, but the wind." Give me your hand. Let me feel its living clasp, and when I have told you, never revert to the tale again. Conceal it from all. Swear that it shall die with us, the last of our predestined race." "Never will I betray your trust. I swear it, never," said Adela firmly, and she drew closer to his side. Then Glyndon commenced his story, that which, perhaps in writing, and to minds prepared to question and disbelieve, may seem cold and terrorless, became far different when told by those blanched lips, with all that truth of suffering which convinces and appalls. Much indeed he concealed, much he involuntarily softened, but he revealed enough to make his tale intelligible and distinct to his pale and trembling listener. "At daybreak," he said, "I left that unhallowed and abhorred abode. I had one hope still. I would seek Mejnour through the world. I would force him to lay at rest the fiend that haunted my soul. With this intent I journeyed from city to city. I instituted the most vigilant researches through the police of Italy. I even employed the services of the Inquisition at Rome, which had lately asserted its ancient powers in the trial of the less dangerous Cagliostro. All was in vain. Not a trace of him could be discovered. I was not alone, Adela." Here Glyndon paused for a moment, as if embarrassed, for in his recital I need scarcely say that he had only indistinctly alluded to Filide, whom the reader may surmise to be his companion. "I was not alone, but the associate of my wanderings was not one in whom my soul could confide. Faithful and affectionate, but without education, without faculties to comprehend me, with natural instincts rather than cultivated reason. One in whom the heart might lean in its careless hours, but with whom the mind could have no commune, in whom the bewildered spirit could seek no guide. Yet in the society of this person the demon troubled me not. Let me explain yet more fully the dread conditions of its presence. In coarse excitement, in commonplace life, in the wild riot, in the fierce excess, in the torpid lethargy of that animal existence which we share with the brutes, its eyes were invisible, its whisper was unheard. But whenever the soul would aspire, whenever the imagination kindled to the loftier ends, whenever the consciousness of our proper destiny struggled against the unworthy life I pursued, then, Adela, then it cowered by my side in the light of noon, or sat by my bed, a darkness visible through the dark. If, in the galleries of divine art, the dreams of my youth woke the early emulation, if I had turned to the thoughts of sages, if the example of the great, if the converse of the wise, aroused the silenced intellect, the demon was with me as by a spell. At last, one evening, at Genoa, to which city I had travelled in pursuit of the mystic, suddenly, and when least expected, he appeared before me. It was the time of the Carnival. It was in one of those half-frantic scenes of noise and revel, called not gaiety, which establish a heathen saturnalia in the midst of a Christian festival. Wearied with the dance, I had entered a room in which several revellers were seated, drinking, singing, shouting, and in their fantastic dresses and hideous masks, their orgy seemed scarcely human. I placed myself amongst them, and in that fearful excitement of the spirits, which the happy never know, I was soon the most riotous of all. The conversation fell on the Revolution of France, which had always possessed for me an absorbing fascination. The masks spoke of the millennium it was to bring on earth, not as philosophers rejoicing in the advent of light, but as ruffians exulting in the annihilation of law. I know not why it was, but their licentious language infected myself, and always desirous to be the foremost in every circle, I soon exceeded even these rioters in declamations on the nature of the liberty which was about to embrace all the families of the globe, a liberty that should pervade not only public legislation, but domestic life, an emancipation from every fetter that men had forged for themselves. In the midst of this tirade, one of the masks whispered me, "Take care, one listens to you who seems to be a spy." My eyes followed those of the mask, and I observed a man who took no part in the conversation, but whose gaze was bent upon me. He was disguised like the rest, yet I found by a general whisper that none had observed him enter. His silence, his attention, had alarmed the fears of the other revelers. They only excited me the more. Wrapped in my subject, I pursued it, insensible to the signs of those about me, and addressing myself only to the silent mask who sat alone, apart from the group. I did not even observe that, one by one, the revelers slunk off, and that I and the silent listener were left alone, until, pausing from my heated and impetuous declamations, I said, "And you, Signor, what is your view of this mighty era? Opinion without persecution, brotherhood without jealousy, love without bondage."
"And life without God,"
added the mask, as I hesitated for new images. The sound of that well-known voice changed the current of my thought. I sprang forward and cried, "Impostor or fiend, we meet at last!" The figure rose as I advanced, and, unmasking, showed the features of Mejnour. His fixed eye, his majestic aspect, awed and repelled me. I stood rooted to the ground.
"Yes," he said solemnly, "we meet, and it is this meeting that I have sought. How hast thou followed my admonitions? Are these the scenes in which the aspirant for the serene science thinks to escape the ghastly enemy? Do the thoughts thou hast uttered, thoughts that would strike all order from the universe, express the hopes of the sage who would rise to the harmony of the eternal spheres?"
"It is thy fault! It is thine!" I exclaimed. "Exorcise the phantom! Take the haunting terror from my soul!" Mejnour looked at me a moment, with a cold and cynical disdain, which provoked at once my fear and rage, and replied,
"No, fool of thine own senses. No, thou must have the full and entire experience of the illusions to which the knowledge that is without faith climbs its Titan way. Thou pantest for this millennium. Thou shalt behold it. Thou shalt be one of its agents of the era of light and reason. I see, while I speak, the phantom thou fliest by thy side. It marshals thy path. It has power over thee as yet, a power that defies my own. In the last days of that revolution which thou hailest, amidst the wrecks of the order thou cursest as oppression, seek the fulfillment of thy destiny, and await thy cure."
At that instant, a troop of masks, clamorous, intoxicated, reeling, and rushing as they reeled, poured into the room, and separated me from the mystic. I broke through them, and sought him everywhere, but in vain. All my researches the next day were equally fruitless. Weeks were consumed in the same pursuit. Not a trace of Mejnour could be discovered. Wearied with false pleasures, roused by reproaches I deserved, recoiling from Mejnour's prophecy of the scene in which I was to seek deliverance, it occurred to me, at last, that in the sober air of my native country, and amidst its orderly and vigorous pursuits, I might work out my own emancipation from the spectre. I left all whom I had before courted and clung to. I came hither. Amidst mercenary schemes and selfish speculations, I found the same relief as in debauch and excess. The phantom was invisible, but these pursuits soon became to me distasteful as the rest. Ever and ever I felt I was born for something nobler than the greed of gain. That life may be made equally worthless, and the soul equally degraded, by the icy lust of avarice, as by the noisier passions. A higher ambition never ceased to torment me. But, continued Glyndon, with a whitening lip and a visible shudder, at every attempt to rise into loftier existence came that hideous form. It gloomed beside me at the easel. Before the volumes of poet and sage it stood with its burning eyes in the stillness of night, and I thought I heard its horrible whispers uttering temptations never to be divulged. He paused, and the drops stood upon his brow. "But I," said Adela, mastering her fears and throwing her arms around him, "but I henceforth will have no life but in thine, and in this love so pure, so holy, thy terror shall fade away." "No, no!" exclaimed Glyndon, starting from her. "The worst revelation is to come. Since thou hast been here, since I have sternly and resolutely refrained from every haunt, every scene in which this preternatural enemy troubles me not, I have... Oh, heaven! Mercy! Mercy! There it stands! There! By thy side! There! There!" And he fell to the ground insensible. Book 5, Chapter 5. A fever, attended with delirium, for several days deprived Glyndon of consciousness, and when, by Adela's care more than the skill of the physicians, he was restored to life and reason, he was unutterably shocked by the change in his sister's appearance. At first he fondly imagined that her health, affected by her vigils, would recover with his own, but he soon saw, with an anguish which partook of remorse, that the malady was deep-seated, deep, beyond the reach of Aesculapius and his drugs. Her imagination, little less lively than his own, was awfully impressed by the strange confessions she had heard, by the ravings of his delirium. Again and again had he shrieked forth, "It is there, there, by thy side, my sister!" He had transferred to her fancy the spectre and the horror that cursed himself. He perceived this, not by her words, but her silence, by the eyes that strained into space, by the shiver that came over her frame, by the start of terror, by the look that did not dare to turn behind. Bitterly he repented his confession. Bitterly he felt that between his sufferings and human sympathy there could be no gentle and holy commune. Vainly he sought to retract, to undo what he had done, to declare all was but the chimera of an overheated brain. And brave and generous was this denial of himself, for often and often, as he thus spoke, he saw the thing of dread gliding to her side, and glaring at him as he disowned its being. But what chilled him, if possible, yet more than her wasting form and trembling nerves, was the change in her love for him. A natural terror had replaced it. She turned paler if he approached. She shuddered if he took her hand. Divided from the rest of earth, the gulf of the foul remembrance yawned now between his sister and himself. He could endure no more the presence of the one whose life, his life, had embittered. He made some excuses for departure, and writhed to see that they were greeted eagerly. The first gleam of joy he had detected since that fatal night on Adela's face he beheld when he murmured farewell. He travelled for some weeks through the wildest parts of Scotland. Scenery which makes the artist was loveless to his haggard eyes. A letter recalled him to London on the wings of new agony and fear. He arrived to find his sister in a condition both of mind and health which exceeded his worst apprehensions. Her vacant look, her lifeless posture, appalled him. It was as one who gazed on the Medusa's head, and felt without a struggle the human being gradually harden to the statue. It was not frenzy, it was not idiocy, it was an abstraction, an apathy, a sleep in waking. Only as the night advanced towards the 11th hour, the hour in which Glyndon had concluded his tale, she grew visibly uneasy, anxious, and perturbed. Then her lips muttered, her hands writhed. She looked round with a look of unspeakable appeal for succor, for protection, and suddenly, as the clock struck, fell with a shriek to the ground, cold and lifeless. With difficulty, and not until after the most earnest prayers, did she answer the agonized questions of Glyndon. At last she owned that at that hour, and that hour alone, wherever she was placed, however occupied, she distinctly beheld the apparition of an old hag, who, after thrice knocking at the door, entered the room, and, hobbling up to her with a countenance distorted by hideous rage and menace, laid its icy fingers on her forehead. From that moment she declared that sense forsook her, and when she woke again, it was only to wait, in suspense that froze up her blood, the repetition of the ghastly visitation. The physician who had been summoned before Glyndon's return, and whose letter had recalled him to London, was a commonplace practitioner, ignorant of the case, and honestly anxious that one more experienced should be employed. Clarence called in one of the most eminent of the faculty, and to him he recited the optical delusion of his sister. The physician listened attentively, and seemed sanguine in his hopes of cure. He came to the house 2 hours before the one so dreaded by the patient. He had quietly arranged that the clocks should be put forward half an hour, unknown to Adela, and even to her brother. He was a man of the most extraordinary powers of conversation, of unsurpassing wit, of all the faculties that interest and amuse. He first administered to the patient a harmless potion, which he pledged himself would dispel the delusion. His confident tone woke her own hopes. He continued to excite her attention, to rouse her lethargy. He jested, he laughed away the time. The hour struck. "Joy, my brother!" she exclaimed, throwing herself in his arms. "The time is past!" And then, like one released from a spell, she suddenly assumed more than her ancient cheerfulness. "Ah, Clarence," she whispered, "forgive me my former desertion. Forgive me that I feared you. I shall live, in my turn, to banish the spectre that haunts my brother." And Clarence smiled and wiped the tears from his burning eyes. The physician renewed his stories, his jests. In the midst of a stream of rich humor that seemed to carry away both brother and sister, Glyndon suddenly saw over Adela's face the same fearful change, the same anxious look, the same restless, straining eye he had beheld the night before. He rose, he approached her. Adela started up. "Look, look, look!" she exclaimed. "She comes! Save me, save me!" And she fell at his feet in strong convulsions as the clock, falsely and in vain put forward, struck the half-hour. The physician lifted her in his arms. "My worst fears are confirmed," he said gravely. "The disease is epilepsy." The next night, at the same hour, Adela Glyndon died. Book 5, Chapter 6. "O joy, joy, thou art come again! This is thy hand, these thy lips. Say that thou didst not desert me from the love of another. Say it again, say it ever, and I will pardon thee all the rest." "Thou hast mourned for me." "Mourned! And thou wert cruel enough to leave me gold. There it is, there, untouched." "Poor child of nature! How, then, in this strange town of Marseilles, hast thou found bread and shelter?" "Honestly, soul of my soul, honestly. But yet by the face thou didst once think so fair. Thinkest thou that now?" "Yes, Filide, more fair than ever. But what meanest thou?" "There is a painter here, a great man, one of their great men at Paris, and I knew not what they call them, but he rules over all here, life and death, and he has paid me largely but to sit for my portrait. It is for a picture to be given to the nation, for he paints only for glory. Think of thy Filide's renown." And the girl's wild eyes sparkled, her vanity roused. "And he would have married me if I would, divorced his wife to marry me. But I waited for thee, ungrateful." A knock at the door was heard. A man entered. "Nicole!" "Ah, Glyndon! Welcome. What, thou art twice my rival, but Jean Nicole bears no malice. Virtue is my dream, my country, my mistress. Serve my country, citizen, and I forgive thee the preference of beauty. Sirrah, sirrah." But as the painter spoke, it hymned, It rolled through the streets, the fiery song of the Marseillaise. There was a crowd, a multitude, a people up, abroad, with colors and arms, enthusiasm and song, with enthusiasm, with colors and arms. And who could guess that that martial movement was one not of war, but massacre, Frenchmen against Frenchmen, for there are two parties in Marseille, and ample work for a Chardon coupe-tête. But this, the Englishman, just arrived, a stranger to all factions, did not as yet comprehend. He comprehended nothing but the song, the enthusiasm, the arms, and the colors that lifted to the sun the glorious lie, Le peuple français debout contre les tyrans. The dark brow of the wretched wanderer grew animated. He gazed from the window on the throng that marched below, beneath their waving oriflamme. They shouted as they beheld the patriot, Nicot, the friend of liberty, and the relentless Hebert by the stranger's side at the casement. "Aye, shout again!" cried the painter. "Shout for the brave Englishman who abjures his pits and his cobourgs to be a citizen of liberty and France." 1,000 voices rent the air, and the hymn of the Marseillaise rose in majesty again. Well, and if it be among these high hopes and this brave people that the phantom is to vanish, and the cure to come, muttered Glinden, and he thought he felt again the elixir sparkling through his veins. "Thou shalt be one of the convention with Pain and Clootz. I will manage it all for thee," cried Nicot, slapping him on the shoulder. "And Paris!" "Ah, if I could but see Paris!" cried Philide in her joyous voice, joyous the whole time, the town, the air, save where, unheard, rose the cry of agony and the yell of murder, or joy. Sleep unhaunting in thy grave, cold Adela. Joy, joy, in the jubilee of humanity, all private griefs should cease. Behold, wild mariner, the vast whirlpool draws thee to its stormy bosom. There the individual is not. All things are of the whole. Open thy gates, fair Paris, for the stranger citizen. Receive in your ranks, O meek republicans, the new champion of liberty, of reason, of mankind. Mejnour is right. It was in virtue, in valor, in glorious struggle for the human race, that the spectre was to shrink to our kindred darkness. And Nicot's shrill voice praised him, and lean Robespierre. "Flambeau, Colomb, Pierre Angulaire de l'édifice de la République," smiled ominously on him from his bloodshot eyes, and Philide clasped him with passionate arms to her tender breast, and at his uprising and downsitting, at board and in bed, though he saw it not, the nameless one guided him with the demon eyes to the sea whose waves were gore.